Hi, this is George Katouf for AgelessTimeless.com, where we try to answer the question, what do you expect for someone my age? Our response, excellence. We try to interview individuals over the age of 50 or those that contribute to the individuals over the age of 50 to ensure that we're doing everything possible to maximize our health potential. Because remember, your body is a temple. So I write articles for the local paper, and I was interviewing a gentleman who was well into his 80s, and he had gotten injured. And he was such a workout fanatic that he had to try to find a way to work out. But when he went to his doctor and he posed the question, how do I keep working out through all this since I broke my arm? And the doctor's response to him was, in his 80s, this gentleman, you're not expecting to get any stronger, are you? And that was like taking a needle and putting it through that gentleman. He really felt defeated and deflated after that. I can guarantee you that the gentleman we're interviewing now would never say that. He is a physician, he's an emergency room doctor, but he also specializes in trying and attempting and succeeding in making individuals who are older, stronger, in better health, better balance, and capable of doing things that they need to do to be functional later in life. So it's a real pleasure today to introduce the author of Body by Science, The Primal Prescription, an Air Force veteran, and this is Dr. Doug McGuff. Dr. McGuff, it's an honor to have you with us today for Ageless Timeless.
It's an honor to be here. I got to say that that would certainly not have been my advice to the 80-year-old gentleman. If any message can come across from this, I think that the adaptive response of skeletal muscle and the physiology in general is intact throughout life. And our experience has been that the people that have the most to gain and have the largest percentage increase in functional ability are the elderly. They literally have the most to gain and can go from being very frail and walker dependent to being stronger than they were when they were in their 20s. I mean, I have clients in my facilities that are in their 70s and 80s that use more resistance than I do on a lot of the movements. So if you know the appropriate stimulus and how to apply it and how to pace the rest intervals between workouts so that progress is forthcoming, it's very predictable and easy to accomplish big improvements for elderly clients.
Well, our viewers might be confused. You're an emergency room physician.
Yeah.
And yet you also operate Ultimate Exercise. Can you talk about how you got involved at a young age in the fitness game, or I should say the resistance game in your case?
Yeah, the clear thing is, everyone hears that I'm an emergency physician, and how does an emergency physician become interested in exercise? The two fields, it would seem to make more sense if I happen to be an orthopedist or a physiatrist or some specialty like that. But the real answer is that my interest in exercise predated me ever going to medical school. I became first interested in it around age 14 or 15. I was racing bicycles, sprint racing, bicycle motocross, and just kind of stumbled across the notion of weight training for that sport. And just the results were almost magical in terms of how much it improved my performance. And it just so happened I was out one day practicing sprints on my bike, and I ran into a gentleman, older guy from, being a 15-year-old kid at my age, probably a guy in his 50s. It was just in fantastic shape, and I just struck up a conversation with him. Turned out that he was an owner of a local Nautilus gym. So Nautilus was the equipment invented by Arthur Jones, kind of an originator of a high-intensity approach to exercise. He invited me to come over, take a look at the place, and it was, just an amazing facility that I could never afford to go to, but I managed to barter janitorial services for a membership there. And one day while carrying out my janitorial services and cleaning his office, I found on his desk the Nautilus Training Principles by Arthur Jones. It was basically a very detailed technical manual of high intensity exercise and how it applied to the equipment. And he let me take a copy of it home, and I read it all in one sitting, and that pretty much changed the course of my life. Results I saw from that kind of training were so amazing that I was hooked for a lifetime. I mean, I became a professional in that sport as a consequence of how well the training regimen worked, and my curiosity over the years stayed with it as the process of high intensity resistance exercise was refined further and further by different people along the way. And when I finally got out of the Air Force in 1997, I decided that I would like to get the most optimized, ideal equipment. And I originally just wanted it for myself, but it ended up in a commercial space, ended up training clients, and that morphed into a personal training business where we do high intensity exercise one-on-one. It's been open since 1997. It's running and training clients right now while we're speaking. So it's been under continuous operation now for 23 years.
How do you have the time to do it?
Well, part of it is I have instructors that I've trained in the protocol that are just really excellent and do an excellent job training the clients and running the place. So it's not exactly on autopilot, but it's not super high maintenance either. So it's something that has allowed me to have longevity in my emergency medicine career, because it's sort of a polar opposite of what emergency medicine is. Emergency medicine is taking people, chronic illness with the wheels coming off, pulling them back out in the 11th hour, whereas this is completely on the opposite end of the spectrum, trying to take people and give them a mechanism whereby they don't ever have to go there. And it's also, a very controlled environment, done by appointment, one-on-one, complete focus, whereas opposed to emergency medicine is completely unscheduled, chaotic, highly stressful, highly disorganized. So it serves as a good countermeasure to my other aspect of my career that I don't think I could have kept with it as long as I have if I hadn't had this other outlet.
What's interesting is I watched one of your YouTube talks. I actually watched many before this interview, and I was impressed with everything you said, but something struck me, and I thought, this cannot be true. So you had said that you could almost determine many of the people that come into the ER repetitively, that they would be on about 33 medications. And I thought, nobody can be on 33 medications. It just so happens my wife is a physician assistant and works in the ER. I said, can somebody be on that many medications? She said, absolutely. That usually is the rule rather than the exception. How did we get to this point that we're trying to cure everything with one biologic to another and ending up with this cascade of pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, and that number has crept up over the years. I remember being amazed, a decade or so back when it was starting to trend upward from 15 to 20 and then 20 to 25. I mean, it's just crept up over the years. And, a lot of medications that people end up on are protocolized. If you end up with hypertension, you end up on hydrochlorothiazide. If you end up with type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome and you're on metformin, then you end up on lisinopril to be renal protective. And a lot of this is protocolized by medical organizations and third-party payers, and a lot of it is oriented towards the pharmaceutical industry. And, a lot of doctors with very good intentions, are trying to steer patients towards lifestyle interventions and things that really move the needle in terms of health. But more and more physicians are finding with patients that it's just futile. So the only thing that they're left with in terms of trying to, rather than treat a disease, you're left with just trying to manage a disease, and it's a very difficult process. And the system has gradually morphed into something that makes it harder and harder to do it in the way that, everyone really intended starting out in the field. So it's just, I won't say that it's not a deep, dark conspiracy, but if one wanted to concoct a deep, dark conspiracy to do things that were, ultimately so bad, you couldn't come up with anything better than what's evolved over time.
When I looked at the information you provided in that interview, you also talked a lot about trauma. And of course, there's a commercial that runs every night that I'm watching a particular channel, and it says 1 in 3 adults over the age of 65 will suffer a fall. And of course, the response is you put an elevator in your home, or you put something in your home that takes you up the staircase so that you don't have to walk.
Yeah.
This would be counterintuitive based on everything that you believe. So if you have somebody that falls and they're older, you talked about how you can determine whether they can go home or not. And that's all done through social workers, people that physical therapists. But could you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So it's funny. I live in kind of in a resort area near a lake, and there's a lot of retirement communities, people building homes on the lake. A lot of homes get built with elevators in them because people approaching retirement age are planning on being non-functional. But to answer your question, back when I was in training in medical school and residency, trauma surgery was kind of a really dramatic occupation. And it was a very rewarding occupation because you were dealing with motor vehicular trauma, knife and gun club kind of trauma, and generally a fairly young, healthy, and functional population that you could literally pull from the jaws of death and send home completely intact, a week to a month later. Now, the number one occupant of trauma services at academic medical centers across the nation, the number one occupant of the trauma service is elderly patients who have sustained ground level falls. And that's simply because they've had muscular deconditioning. A lot of people think that it's a balance issue, but balance is entirely related to your muscular strength. Old people have limited range of motion in their joints and tend to walk very stiff and upright because they're relying on a bone-on-bone tower to maintain their balance. So when all your bones are vertically aligned, you can stay upright. But if they break the angle in their knee or their hip at all, to where it bends just slightly, they don't have enough strength to keep themselves upright. So if they hit the edge of a rug or if someone bumps them, they're going down. So you have someone that is this weak and this frail that sustains a ground level fall, and you're going to end up with someone that's got, a femoral neck fracture, an inferior pubic ramus fracture, which is part of the pelvis, maybe a compression fracture of a lumbar vertebra, and a humeral neck fracture, and maybe 3 or 4 broken ribs. Well, that's multi-trauma. And the consequences of multi-trauma for someone that frail are really severe. And it turned out that we actually had a trauma conference with a director of trauma surgery from Vanderbilt that was organizing something called a Palliate Consortium. And what they ended up finding out was through a very simple screening mechanism that has now been formalized into a much more detailed screening mechanism, but it basically boiled down that if you had an elderly fall that was multi-trauma, If before their fall they could get up out of a chair under their own power using their legs, almost everyone went home. If they could get up out of a chair, but they had to do it in stages and had to use their arms to push off and do it in 3 or 4 steps, they had about a 50% chance of going home alive. But if you have an elderly person that sustains a ground level fall, and prior to that fall, their functional ability was such that they could not get out of a chair without the assistance of another person, those people don't go home. And now the trauma services are using screening tools to decide what was your pre-injury level of function, to decide what the level of intervention you're going to receive is. And if your level of functioning was one of a person with loss of muscle mass, sarcopenia, and being profoundly weak, there's going to be an early move to move you towards comfort care only in a hospice setting, rather than expending resources to try to get you back home. And that's how profound being muscularly weak is when one is elderly.
In Ageless Timeless, our goal is to keep individuals, not just older individuals, but all individuals healthy and strong. Yeah. And the thing is, you talk about aerobic exercises, and there seems to be, going back to the Cooper Institute, a misconception as to what aerobic really is. Because if you talk to somebody about aerobic conditioning, they'll say, well, that's your VO2 max, and it's how fast you can run and how long you can run. And I think that's probably what a lot of people believe, more often than not. But you have a different twist on aerobic conditioning. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the definition of aerobic conditioning was really simply a result of the limitations of the testing modalities in the late 1960s and early 1970s. So to measure VO2 max, you have to have a tight-fitting mask and a hose that's running into a machine that's measuring your exhaled carbon dioxide versus your inhaled, partial pressure of oxygen, and determining what your oxygen consumption is. And it has to have a very tight seal, and as such, you really can't be moving around or move from one station to another or anything of that nature. So the testing for exercise back then, that was the only measuring tool they had, and it required you to be in one place. So it was all done either on a treadmill or a bicycle ergometer or something that did not move around. And it naturally, because there was muscular effort being involved and ramping up the metabolism, it showed improvements that could be indirectly linked back to improvements in health. But the default conclusion became that steady state activity, like what could be measured on the machine, was the preferable activity for invoking health changes. And that particular apparatus was just measuring aerobic metabolism, which is only one subsegment of metabolism. It's the portion of metabolism that's carried out by the mitochondria in the cells of your body. So if we're looking at the screen that I'm on here, if we have this little mouse representing a mitochondria, we have to realize that in the cell, it's not just that aerobic metabolism is going on when exercise is happening. What's actually happening is that glucose is being pushed into the cell and metabolized through a 20-step process, throwing off some energy-containing molecules called ATP. At the end of that process, you have a chemical called pyruvate. Turns out that this mitochondria used to be outside the cell as a protobacteria that ate the waste products of the cell. That ended up getting incorporated into the cell during evolution and became an organelle. So it eats the pyruvate, it gets cycled through the mitochondria in the presence of oxygen, and that makes additional ATP. One cycle of this may make about 24, 26 molecules of ATP versus 2 to 4 out of glycolysis. But this is what was only being measured by the VO2 max testing, but completely ignoring that all this other stuff was going on before there. The deal is, though, that this glycolysis process can produce substrate much faster than the mitochondria can take it up. So when you really perform meaningful exercise, you produce pyruvate faster than the mitochondria can use it. Well, that has metabolic consequences as well. That pyruvate that doesn't get processed in the mitochondria gets turned into lactic acid. That lactic acid has other functions. It is a chemical signal to other organs in the body to behave certain ways. It activates brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It enhances memory. It gets cycled back through the liver through a process called the Cori cycle, a metabolic process where the lactate gets converted back to glucose and recycled again, almost like afterburner fuel. So the big message is when you're doing exercise, there's a lot more metabolically going on than just this. The other thing is when you've done high intensity exercise, all that lactate and pyruvate that's stacked up, when you stop, gets processed through the mitochondria over the next half hour to 45 minutes, the same way as if you were doing steady state aerobic exercise. So it turns out that you can do a type of exercise that's going to have additional benefits. It's going to have benefits to other segments of your metabolism that don't include just the mitochondria, but it also involves a type of exercise that produces a meaningful demand on skeletal muscle that's actually going to produce strengthening and improvement in functional ability. It's going to produce a type of exercise that empties the glucose stores out of the skeletal muscle, restoring insulin sensitivity. And it's going to result in a type of tissue enhancement within the skeletal muscle that turns out, unbeknownst to us until just the past 10 years or so, turns out to be the largest endocrine signaling organ in our body, signaling healthful benefits to every other tissue in the body through a myriad of different chemical messengers. So over time, we found a type of exercise that produces all the benefits of the aerobic subsegment, but also allows you to hit all these different other body systems in a way that are much more adaptive, but also not in a repetitive and high force situation like running or jogging does. So you're not going to tear your joints up in the process either. So it's a safe protocol that produces global metabolic conditioning, not just aerobic, and it produces improvements in skeletal muscle, which signal improvements throughout the body. And that's based on a biological first principle that movement is our most preserved biologic function. Without movement, we can't get food. We can't keep from becoming food. It's the essence of what being an animal is. And it only makes sense that stimulating that tissue is going to have benefits for every other system in the body.
And that stimulation is done through high intensity training. And I think a lot of people would be surprised, even people that go to the gym repetitively, maybe 3 or 4 times a week, that they're really not lifting in a manner that you would consider high intensity training and that would elicit the responses that you just mentioned. Because you talk about the 4 muscle fibers, and it doesn't appear that that sequence is usually charged by the way people are traditionally lifting. In other words, if you go to a gym and you do 1 set of bench presses or on a machine and you take a break and then you do another set, that's not necessarily eliciting those responses. Could you explain that a bit?
Sure, and that's just natural, and that's human nature, and it's programmed into our biology to avoid deep fatigue. That has to be something that is imposed on us for us to do it organically and naturally, and we used to exist in an environment that presented that to us on a regular and frequent enough basis that we had those kind of adaptations. But that's not the case anymore. So it turns out movement is our most preserved biologic function. But in terms of an adaptation, something that threatens that biologic function is the stimulus that generates an adaptation to be stronger and more capable. So when you're performing work with muscle, most people that go into a gym and do some meaningful work lifting weights will usually stop well short of having produced a depth of fatigue that's going to serve as a strong stimulus. Some people may accumulate some fatigue over multiple sets, but they've incurred a volume of work that's hard to recover from, and a volume of work that over a long time results in unnecessary wear and tear without ever really getting to the most powerful portion of the stimulus. So when you're performing work with skeletal muscle, the muscle responds in a predictable and ordered fashion. So your muscle fibers are arranged in groupings that are spread homogeneously throughout the muscle. And we'll just roughly call it, for simplicity's sake, we'll call it 3 different types of fibers. So at a low level of demand, you will first recruit fibers that fatigue slowly and produce a low level of force output and recover quickly. And those are arranged in groups of fibers that are relatively small, but a lot of those groups, those will be recruited first. If you're performing work that's demanding enough to cause those to fatigue where they can't recover and recycle, you will move next to an intermediate group of fibers that are slightly less enduring. They recover more slowly, but they generate more force. So if you have been presented with something challenging enough to knock that first set of fibers out, you will now recruit the second set of fibers. And if the exertion is uninterrupted and severe enough, those fibers will drop out due to fatigue because they fatigue even a little more quickly than the first ones. And you will now cycle into a third and final set of fibers that produce large amounts of force output, but they're not as enduring and they recover much more slowly. And those are always held in reserve. They are recruited last. But they are also the fibers that are most adaptable, and they're the fibers that we use for really important high output muscular effort. Those are almost never tapped by someone exercising under their own supervision because it is our instinct to preserve those, to hold them in reserve. But if you tap those, challenge them, and fatigue them, that serves as a powerful stimulus for muscular and metabolic adaptations because you have threatened your most preserved biologic function, which is movement, and the response then becomes, we need to be a little bit stronger. So the next time we encounter something of this magnitude, we have some reserves left over. And that just happens in a stepwise fashion when you're performing appropriate resistance exercise. And by doing that, you produce an intensity of effort that challenges all of your metabolic machinery, but also produces a stimulus that says those existing muscle fibers need to be more capable, bigger, and stronger.
And the recovery would be about a week or more. Is that correct? If you tap that final stage.
Variable based on circumstances. It's variable amongst individuals. It's variable depending on how severe the exercise was and what the volume of exercise done was. You could be recovered within 72 hours, 96 hours. But in general, the clients that we train at my facility, we train the vast, vast majority once a week. And if the intensity is that high, you got to remember that the adaptation you're asking for is actually the creation of new tissue. And that doesn't just happen overnight. It's a process that takes a little bit of time to recover from. And if we think of the process of the stimulus like digging a hole in the ground and the adaptive response like filling the hole up plus a little mound on top, that takes time. And if you come back with the stimulus and dig again before you filled up, you just dig a deeper and deeper hole. So the part of the equation that gets ignored a lot in typical thinking about exercise, which doesn't recognize that exercise doesn't directly cause an adaptive change. Exercise is a threatful stimulus that acts upon the body. The body, having received that stimulus, synthesizes a response. But that response takes time, and you have to allow enough time for that response to occur. And that's why we wait a week, because that gives you enough time to synthesize the new tissue, to upregulate the enzymes that support it, and to signal all the other tissues in the body that they need to increase their capability to provide the support that those tissues need, whether that be nervous tissue, increased bone density because of the tendons that are attaching to them. All these things take time, and you need to allow enough time for that process to occur.
You've just taken away a lot of the social time that people have in gyms. They only come once a week instead of 3-4 times. Let's talk about if somebody came to your facility. You talked about 5 exercises that you would likely have them perform on machines. What would that look like typically?
Yeah, so in the book Body by Science, we make a point of a big 5 approach. There's nothing really magical about those 5 movements. I just chose them because from a biomechanical standpoint, they are simple to learn and simple to perform, and they cover a lot of musculature at once. What that allows is for the exercising subject to be able to have a lot of concentration available for effort rather than coordination. Because to get to the level of fatigue that we're looking for, every instinct in our body fights against that. So you actually have to have mental focus and intellectual discipline to know what we're going after, and it takes a lot of concentration. So we picked these 5 movements because they're simple multi-joint movements that are very easy to do naturally, and that leaves a lot of focus left over for the fact that it's going to take a lot of concentration to work this hard. So the big 5 that we discuss in the book that we use a lot down at my facility are a compound rowing exercise, which is an upper body horizontal pull, a chest press exercise, which is a compound upper body pushing movement, then a under grip pull down, which is a compound vertically oriented pulling movement, and then an overhead press, which is a compound vertically oriented pressing movement, and then a leg press, which is just a lower body pressing movement, but it is such a biomechanically complex process. It's going to involve the lower back, the buttocks, the hamstring, the quadriceps, calves, soleus, all of that are involved in that. So through those 5 big movements, you cover almost all the major muscular structures in the body in a way that's very aggressive and focused, and is a strong stimulus for strengthening over the entire all the muscular structures of the body. So it's done in a very aggressive and time-effective manner.
That's the other thing. If you read any muscle magazines, which I don't, but if you did, oftentimes they recommend 5 sets of 5 or 3 sets of 8 to 12 or something like that. This is not like that at all. If, for example, somebody was doing a vertical press in your facility, they would have to do it in a manner that is probably foreign to most people. Can you explain the slow nature of the movements from eccentric and concentric?
Yeah. So when someone's in a gym doing multiple sets, think of it as the stimulus is a nearby town that you're traveling to. You can get to that nearby town by getting on the highway that heads to that town and heading straight there. Or you can do a little circle around every half mile 5 times until you get there. But you have to accumulate enough fatigue to generate the stimulus. We get at it directly. And the way we get at it is by continuously loading the muscle. And the way we continuously load the muscle is to deliberately move slow. The way most people will lift weights is instinctually to jab at it and get it moving just to complete a repetition without any idea of what the real stimulus is to continuously load the muscle so it fatigues quickly. It's not just making the weight go up and down. So what we will do is we have the person initiate the movement as gradually as possible. So barely applying pressure until the movement arm starts to move, the weight stack barely cracks, and we try to get them to take 3 seconds to move that first inch. After that, we just want them to push hard and keep the weight moving. But deprived of momentum, what you'll find is that that excursion will complete in around 7 to 10 seconds. And then we have them slowly cycle back and lower the weight over 7 to 10 seconds. Never letting the weight bottom out. When the weight stack barely touches, you immediately head back up in the other direction. And that results in depriving the exercising subject of any momentum that allows the muscle to get a respite or to get out from under the load of the weight. When the muscle is continuously loaded, you rapidly fatigue it, so you cycle through all those fiber types quickly enough that they don't get a chance to recover, and you end up tapping the highest order fibers that are recruited only when everything else has been fatigued out of the equation. And when you've done that, you have then provided a powerful stimulus, but we go directly at it. So a set done in that way, going on the straight line to the other town, probably takes 90 to 120 seconds done at that cadence. Well, that's the other thing people don't realize is they watch some person come into a commercial gym, they piddle around, they talk to their friends, they do 5 sets of 5. Mm-hmm. But they're doing it this fast cadence, so that 5 repetitions is probably going to take 12 to 18 seconds. So if you go watch your normal gym rat and you run a stopwatch of just the time that they're actually under the load doing the work, and it takes them an hour and a half in the gym, but you only record the time where they have weight in their hand and are performing work, versus the elapsed time where people are under load in my facility, even though they get out of the gym in 12 to 15 minutes at my shop, they have actually spent more time under meaningful load than the guy that's been at the commercial gym for an hour and a half. It's just that we have wasted no time getting to the stimulus. We head directly there through continuous and uninterrupted loading of the muscle that is completely deprived of any momentum or any rest, that short circuits the process of getting to that fatigue point, which is the stimulus for adaptation.
And that fatigue point is when you can no longer do a movement. Is that correct?
Correct. So let's say that you have 100 units of strength when you're completely fresh in any given movement. So I wouldn't pick 100 units of resistance on the machine, because the moment you accumulate any fatigue and your force output drops to 99, you'll be done after 1 repetition and you will not have fatigued yourself very deeply. So let's say the very top of your screen is your capability. Instead, I'm going to pick a weight down here at about 70% of your capability. And I'm going to have you lift and lower the weight very slowly. And as you do so, your force output due to fatigue starts to drop and drop and drop and drop. So the window between your maximal force output and the resistance I've selected starts to narrow as you go through the set. And after 90 or 100 seconds, all of a sudden you're going to have accumulated enough fatigue where your maximal force output is no longer 100, it's now 70. And as soon as your force output drops below the resistance I've selected, movement will stop you will be pushing as hard as you can and as fast as you can, but the weight is no longer moving. At that point, we have you attempt to continue to produce movement, imagining in your mind's eye that the repetition is completing, even though movement is not occurring. That recruits even higher order motor units in the muscle and fatigues those out, so that at the end of the set, your maximal force output might be 40 or 50 units. So what we've done in about 90 seconds is we have decreased your muscle's force producing capability by 50%. And it is that rapid and deep fatiguing of muscle that is the threatful stimulus that your body receives that says, ooh, I got to be a little bit stronger in case I ever encounter this again. And then that's just done in stepwise fashion over time.
In terms of the equipment you use, it's machines.
Yes.
It's not free weights, but you do mention that you could use free weights as long as you had safety pins and you had a rack, and
yeah,
you could do that.
Absolutely. And what you'll find, though, is with free weights or equipment that is not as ideally designed, there are, for instance, when you're doing a bench press, when your shoulders are roughly at 90 degrees, your elbows are roughly at 90 degrees, the lever effect of those limbs on the weight is minimal, so it feels heavier there. There's a sticking point. And if you're moving too slowly with that, then that sticking point will be very difficult to overcome. So when you're doing this sort of protocol with free weights, the cadence will be just a little bit faster. So rather than, except certain movements, but anything where there's a sticking point, the cadence can be a little faster. So still not fast, still not explosive, but the excursion of the repetition may be 4 or 5 seconds up, and then 5 to 7 seconds down, just so that you're not lingering so long in that sticking point that you can't get past it, but still depriving yourself of momentum, depriving yourself of resting in a locked out position is the best way to fatigue the muscle rapidly and deeply. And you can do this with free weights. You can do it with free hand exercise. It doesn't require fancy equipment at all.
Would this transfer then to somebody who wanted to just see how much they could lift at a certain point? Would it transfer in terms of improved strength?
Sure. You have to be careful, though, not to conflate something that is a stimulus for strength versus demonstrating strength. So if someone wants to be a power lifter, this sort of protocol is the best way to get stronger, but it's clearly not the best way to demonstrate the strength in terms of how much weight can you make go up. That is actually a very specific skill, to be able to recruit fibers rather than sequentially. So to do powerlifting, rather than recruiting the first type of fiber, fatiguing those, then tapping into the second type of fiber, fatiguing those, and then tapping into the third type of fiber. When you want to demonstrate strength like a power lifter, what you have to do is a type of neurological event where you're recruiting all 3 fiber types in tandem simultaneously. That is a skill that's dependent upon strength. The best way to build strength is the way that we have described. Once you build the strength, you do have to have rehearsal of demonstrating that strength through concurrent and simultaneous recruitment of all, and that's a skill just like any other sport. But strength that's built through a proper protocol can be used to demonstrate skill in any realm, whether that skill is powerlifting with a squat or a bench press or a deadlift, or whether that skill is being explosive off the starting blocks in a 100-meter dash, or being explosive off the offensive line in American football. The capability of strong muscle can be expressed in many different realms, but the optimal expression of that strength requires specific training of the skill in question. So, but one has to be very clear when you're really properly training an athletic skill to separate your strength conditioning from your skill conditioning. They're two entirely different things. And the further apart you keep those two things, the better your result will be.
So one thing that you mentioned in one of your talks was the fact that over the age of 65, there's about a 30% loss of strength in 12 years. Is that correct?
Devoid of any stimulus to keep it there, yeah. In contemporary Western society, it may be even more rapid than that and earlier than that. I mean, I see people in their 20s and 30s that are profoundly weak. But yeah, that's absolutely a common statistic.
So what do we do to change this paradigm? It seems like we have a mindset where people walk a lot, which I guess is good, the 10,000 steps. The idea that maybe we perform sprints is kind of out the window. I don't see people doing that at an older age.
Yeah.
Typically. I do, but I don't see too many people doing that. The point being, what can we do to turn this around? Because I think the mindset now is, well, I'm 50, I'm 60, I'm 70. I really have to just settle for the fact that I'm not going to be that strong and just let it go.
Yeah, it's absolutely wrong. And the thing is we can take someone that is walker dependent and have them walker independent in 6 to 12 weeks. Wow. No problem. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. It's just a matter of applying the stimulus properly. And 10,000 steps, yeah, that's a good thing. But that 10,000 steps is not going to slow or have any impact at all on the decline that you described. Because all you're doing there is you're cycling through that lowest order motor units. You're not fatiguing them rapidly enough so they have time to recover. So you're just cycling through those weakest and slowest motor units over and over again, allowing all these other motor units just to decay. There's not enough stimulus there for strengthening. And the other thing is the 10,000 steps, to my way of thinking, is a reversal of cause and effect. And what I see is that when I get older clients that have become very deconditioned and weak, once I have increased their strength by about 40%, which is very easy to do, they spontaneously and organically become active. So when someone has adequate muscular strength, the level of activity that equals 10,000 steps per day will happen organically and spontaneously as an expression of their enhanced functional ability. So you don't have to wear your Fitbit. You don't got to go, ooh, I need 2,000 more steps today. Let me walk circles around my couch. What I found is that people that have been trained up to have adequate muscular strength are unrestrainable in their activity level and will accumulate that level of activity just as a spontaneous expression of their strong musculature. And that's the right way to go about it. If you get someone strong enough, the activity takes care of itself.
And with running and walking and all these things, we get mixed messages. You know, at one point, you'll hear that being a marathoner is a detriment to your overall health. And then you'll have other studies that suggest it's a great thing. It'll extend life. And you hear the same thing about just jogging, that it'll extend life by 3 years. What's your take on all this? Because you used to be a runner, I believe. I don't know if you still are.
Yeah, I still do for recreational reasons and just get out on a nice day kind of stuff. But a lot of it depends on who you are and how you're built. But running in and of itself is not necessarily healthy activity. It is healthy to be physically active. But to me, that physical activity ideally is an expression of a healthy state that is a result of a strong musculature. But doing it in and of itself for an activity for health's sake is extremely inefficient, results in a lot of repetitive use, and I think Kenneth Cooper is going to be remembered not as the man that saved America's heart, but as the man that destroyed America's hips and knees. More people that took up that kind of exercise in the 70s and 80s are having knee and hip replacements now. It's a very high force, low intensity form of exercise that does have some health benefits, but they are offset by the inefficiencies of the exercise and the damage that it can cause. And I would say if you want to be a runner, it used to be, make sure you're in aerobic condition before you go lift weights. My point of view is make sure that you have lifted weights and you're adequately strong before you take up any high force endeavor or sport, because you need that protection from that strong musculature to dissipate the forces away from your joints, to help absorb those forces and to provide the surrounding supporting musculature that keeps them as protected as possible if you're going to perform something that is that high force.
Well, I think your philosophies, which are backed by research, are the way to go. If we can encourage more and more people to develop their strength, we're going to have a much healthier society. You're going to have far fewer people falling and not being able to get back up. In fact, I just did a video on that because I do falls in my gym. But the thing is, why hasn't your message been more universally accepted? Why are we still at the point where there doesn't seem to be a target in that area? And frankly, I can see where the younger generation coming up, we're actually doing less of these types of things rather than more. I talk to people who are physical educators, and they tell me that doing push-ups and doing sit-ups and these kind of things are almost outdated. They don't even do them anymore. A lot of
I don't think it has to do so much with exercise or anything to do with it. It's a much wider cultural problem of just less orientation towards being capable, less orientation towards personal responsibility, a development of technology that makes it acceptable for you to be non-functional at that level. We're in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic. There's lots of focus on the peculiarities of the virus and what's made it so severe, but there's been almost no focus on the peculiar aspects of the population that's become infected. When you have, so much deconditioning, a lack of muscle-generated anti-inflammatory myokines or chemical messengers out of the skeletal muscle, an overabundance of fat that has been generated by consumption of industrial seed oils, resulting in an overstorage of fat that are really the chemical precursors of the inflammatory cytokines, you have a population that, under different circumstances, with appropriate conditioning, may have had a much less severe response to this infection. But you have huge swatches of the population that are vulnerable from a metabolic standpoint. And that's true across the board in society. And it's something that just, is going to have to change. And that change may unfortunately be one of attrition. I think the people that take this up are going to be the more robust people over time. And I'm hoping that it gains some traction. But I'm not fully confident that it will. But I guess the short answer to that, and the briefest one I can give, is why has it not gained more popularity? And I think because it has to appeal to a type of person that understands that worthwhile things involve really hard work. And this sort of training is, in fact, hard as hell at any age. And it's just a minority of the population that is willing to make that sort of sacrifice for something worthwhile. But I'm very happy to orient myself to that subsegment.
Politicians talk a lot about healthcare, and I talk a lot about care for your own health. I think if we had more people adopting the concepts that you've just brought forward, we would have such a healthy society, so much healthier than we have right now. So I would encourage anyone that's watching this. I've been blown away by Dr. McGuff's presentations and his books, to read them and understand what he's driving at. What he's saying is, you got to start out with strength building. And once you do that, if you like to play golf, if you like to run, if you like to do martial arts, whatever, Zumba, you can do those things. But if you don't focus on strength building, you're going to be isolated and find that the deterioration is going to occur over time. And in spite of what you think, it will happen. And I tell this to my students who are in their 20s, and they look at me like I have 3 heads. But then with time, as I see them 10 years later, they say you were right. So it doesn't take long to start to deteriorate.
And it doesn't have to be that way. The approach is amazingly simple.
Okay. Well, Dr. McGuff, it's been a real honor today. And as I said when I started this, I didn't think that we could cover this in one segment. And I hope you'd be willing to come back and talk again, because you are a wealth of information.
My pleasure.
More people need to embrace what you've just told us. So please, viewers,
don't work in that realm.
Say that again, sir.
I said I appreciate your work in that realm as well.
Well, I'm doing my best. If I can bring people like you to the public and get them to understand, don't just watch this and then sit on your duff. Get up and start doing some activities that are going to encourage those muscle groups to activate. And you're going to be a much healthier older adult. I didn't ask you your age, Dr. McGuff, if you don't mind sharing that.
I'm 50. How old am I? I'm 58, heading on 59 here.
You can't even remember. That's how fit you are. Okay.
How old would you be if you didn't know how old you was?
Satchel Paige.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. You take care, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
All right. Thank you, sir.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.